Okay, welcome back, everyone. We are now entering our next session with Megan Sheldon from Be Ceremonial. She will be taking us through a workshop on ritual, creating ritual and what ritual means. Megan is a cultural mythologist, end-of-life storyteller, and life cycle celebrant. She's been crafting and convening ceremonies for years, drawing on secular and universal rituals to support individuals and families during times of transition. She and her husband created the world's very first ceremony creation platform called Be Ceremonial, which she will be sharing with us all today. And we are so thankful to have her here joining us. I believe she's in Canada. She will say more about that as well. Just a couple housekeeping reminders. We do have everyone muted. Please remain muted unless otherwise called upon. The chat function will be used in this session, so please treat this space respectfully, free of any words of hatred or judgment. We are looking to maintain the safety and brave space that we've created. Anyone that does abuse this space will be removed from the summit. And if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat throughout and they'll be addressed. So Megan, I'm going to pass it over to you, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's nice to be here with you. I am going to start us off with a candle lighting ritual before we move into a land acknowledgement. If you are joining here live today, you're welcome to turn your video on if you like, or if you have a candle nearby and you're watching the recording. It's always just so nice to feel an energetic connection with those that I'm speaking with, but I also understand that you have a lot going on in your day and you might be watching the recording as well. The candle lighting is one of my favorite rituals because it can be adapted to so many different occasions. I host a lot of virtual memorials and virtual celebrations of life, and a community candle lighting can really connect people across the screen, especially during times of grief. I'm just going to take a minute. I've got these beautiful incense matches that just kind of fill my air with a big aroma, but I'm going to light this for a moment. Lighting a candle is an intentional act that evokes quiet, sacred space. It's good for magic and self-care. It's a thing of beauty that can turn an ordinary space into something sacred. I love this quote that I'm going to share with you. I'll share it in the chat in a moment. On a symbolic level, a candle embodies the 5 elements: earth, water, air, fire, and spirit. The wick and base signify earth and are vital for keeping the flame steady. The wax, which transforms from a solid to a liquid and then to a gas, emulates the transmutational properties of the water element. Oxygen, representative of air, is crucial for both keeping the flame lit and extinguishing it. And then there's the flame, which is a direct connection to fire, the element of transformation and rebirth. Fire also represents passion and governs our willpower. And lastly, the 5th element, spirit, which is us when we focus our intention into the candle and infuse it with our soul and energy. So my invitation for you today is, if you need to leave early or when we close our time together, or if you're watching the recording, is to kind of keep your candle lit for the duration. And then when you need to go, just take a moment and bring your candle forward, take a few deep breaths and blow it out, and wait until the wax kind of hardens and the smoke dissipates before you rush on to the rest of our day. I think that we're constantly in this kind of cycle of moving. I know I am. I've come from one meeting, I have another meeting. And if we forget to kind of open and close our time together, we carry that with us. So for me, a big part of ceremony, as I'll go in today, is kind of defining that container, that ceremonial structure where we open ourselves in, we go through an experience, and then we close it, and then we move on. I want to give this opportunity to both pause and reflect for each of you, whether you're watching the recording or you're here live, on where we are all located in this expansive world of ours. Zoom brings us together from many different places. I'd love to invite everybody that's here today to add in the chat where you're joining us from. You can offer us both the traditional name and the settler name of the land where you live and work. And if you aren't sure, there's this beautiful website. I'm going to add it to the chat where you can learn more. So I will add mine here. Yes, Beth, I will share the poem that I read from in a moment, or the quote. Denver, Tennessee, Michigan, California, Colorado, Winnipeg, New York. Here in Canada, I've been reflecting a lot on what it means to live and work on stolen land and to work with ritual and ceremony. I'm being asked to reflect on my own biases and consider my own assumptions when it comes to ritual and ceremony. As such, I've worked hard with my partners to develop this ceremony acknowledgement that is in the chat that you're welcome to read, as well as a bit of a guide when it comes to cultural appropriation and appreciation. It's something that I won't tap into too much today, but when we're working with ritual and ceremony, I've kind of framed today as a secular approach or universal approach, meaning that I'm very mindful of the rituals that I have permission to use and access to. Part of that is based on where I live in the world, knowing what I can and cannot move into, also looking at my own heritage and where I've been and what I've learned along the way. So it is a difficult and challenging and enriching conversation that I invite each of you to explore on your own. Before we kind of move into the kind of meat and bones of my workshop, I'm going to just share my screen for a minute. So we're going to be exploring today the elements of ceremony. As some of you heard in my introduction, I am a life cycle celebrant. I have a master's in cultural mythology. I am an end-of-life doula and a grief doula. I have done lots of training and lots of ritual and ceremony for people across the life cycle. Along the way, I've really kind of learned some of these elements that we've adapted and brought into Be Ceremonial, which is our create your own, choose your own ritual adventure kind of platform. And I love this quote by Eileen London. When we engage in ritual, we address our need to feel connected to ourselves, to each other, and to the world. And that's really my goal as a celebrant and doula, is to help people find ritual that connects themselves and to each other and to this world. The ceremony acknowledgement we went through. So this is what I would love before we kind of move in, just to kind of share in the chat. What's your baggage when it comes to ritual and ceremony? What are some of the biases or preconceived notions or worries and fears or expectations you feel? If somebody were to ask you to create a ceremony or do a ceremony for yourself or invite ritual into your day, what are some of the things that you might be struggling with or have questions around? I'm going to open it up to the chat. And you might not have any at this point. I know that when I stepped into this work, I really didn't feel like I had ritual in my life. I thought that it was something that I didn't necessarily have access to. I'm not religious. I don't have a strong kind of cultural connection. Katie, yes, the ritual might be received woo-woo. That's definitely been a big challenge for me. I don't have a direct framework when it comes to my spirituality. It doesn't necessarily fit into one box. Does anyone else have any questions or concerns or worries when it comes to kind of bringing ritual and ceremony in? How do you research how to know which rituals you can access without appropriation? Abby, that's a really good question. If you look at the link that I sent earlier around appropriation or appreciation, there's a kind of a checklist that we've gathered from folks that are doing a lot of this work. And I invite you to kind of, when you have a ritual that you would like to explore and bring it into your practice, go through that checklist around who's profiting and how you're crediting the person that might have came from. Oftentimes asking people, like I know here in Vancouver, Canada, where we have a strong Indigenous population, and in talking with, in learning and unlearning about what is permissible as me, a white settler, to perform, I've learned that things like burning sage and calling it smudging it would be cultural appropriation. So instead, I've looked back into my own heritage, and I have Celtic heritage, Irish and Scottish and Welsh. And in my direct lineage, people would often burn dried lavender as a way to cleanse space. So I feel I can take dried lavender and burn it and have my own experience because I understand the roots of the ritual. So that's often a good way to kind of go. Beth, following up with footwork after ritual, not taking back what released and set an intention. Beth, do you mean like your questions around like how to follow up after? Was that? Can add more to the. Anyway, I invite you to continue to add questions in there as we go, because I think that I teach a lot of trainings around ritual and ceremony, and oftentimes the big questions I get is either people have preconceived ideas of what ritual and ceremony was. Either they were raised in a certain way that brought ritual and ceremony into their lives, and so it kind of holds this fixed nature. And then you kind of have someone like me who is allowing this unfixed kind of adaptability, allowing rituals to become what we need. Not necessarily throwing away the ones that are rooted in tradition, but allowing them to reflect our current reality. So that's been a big journey for me, and I will share a little bit more about that. I'm going to go back to the screen share for a minute. As a company, as both Seeking Ceremony is my work as a ritualist and celebrant, and then my husband and I are building the Ceremonial. Our guiding principles are that we believe ceremony is vital for the well-being of our community. We really approach this from a descriptive, not prescriptive way. I think that for so long I was told how to follow a ceremony, whether it was a wedding or a funeral or a birth. And there is benefit in that, but for me, I really wanted this to be a creative act, a self-expression. So I offer people things to inspire them, places to get started. The app that we built is like a choose your own ritual adventure. So you get to kind of take all these rituals and pick and choose the ones that you like, and then build them into your own practice and your own life. I believe that we already have what we need to create ritual and ceremony. I think that for most of us, we just need to remember and be connected with those that might have a more rigorous ritual practice. I believe that if we're curious and we want to learn from others, and also to be respectful of ancestral traditions, Indigenous practices, and cultural rituals, we continue to learn and unlearn the stories and practices we've been given, and we commit to sharing and creating an open space. So that's what's guiding me. I think that it's been an amazing journey to move into this ceremony and ritual work over the past decade or so, because people that are drawn to it tend to be people that have questions like mine, or we're filling the gap. This beautiful friend of mine, Quinita Robertson, shared that she feels that there is a ceremony-shaped hole in our society right now. And when she said that, I just kind of took a breath and I thought, wow, that's it. That's how I've been feeling. I've been feeling this gap, this missing link. I wanted to then move into this idea of grieving versus mourning, because I think this is often, we're talking today about grief, but for me, grief is what we feel, kind of what we hold on the inside. And grief rituals for me tend to be more focused on self-care. how I kind of am sitting with my grief inside of me and what I can do to express it or release it or honor it. Mourning is the outward expression of that grief. So it's when we come together as a community. It's when we share our grief and we hold space for it together. And just to give you an example, I'm going to stop the screen share for a minute. During the pandemic, I was holding a lot of grief. I've had a lot of grief in my life. My husband and I had recurrent miscarriages while losing a parent. We've had a lot of traumatic kind of illness in our family. And then the pandemic hit, and it was just like it was one too many things for my grief to handle. My grief was feeling very isolated. I was home alone with small kids and my husband, and I started to swim in the ocean. And here in Vancouver, Canada, the Pacific Ocean is pretty cold. It was in February that I started, and it was an acknowledgement of my own grief. I would go into the sea and feel my grief and let it go and release it and honor it. And yet I wasn't quite achieving what I needed. I wanted community to witness this space, and I wanted to hold space for others. So I put a call out to the people in my community. And for the last 2 years now, every week, every Sunday, a group of us gather, and it's different group every week. People can show up or not. There's about 50 people that kind of step into this practice, and it's a grief ceremony. And we meet at the beach at a set designated time. And we spend about 5 or 10 minutes combing the beach, combing the kind of beach floor, thinking about our grief. It might be a big grief that week. It might be something that is connected to somebody who died or somebody we lost in our life, or something kind of more traumatic that's happened. It might be more of a small grief. I remember that during the pandemic, I had a lot of grief around the playgrounds being closed. I had small kids, and walking by the playground every day was just this reminder of the fact that my kids weren't getting this normalcy. They were stuck inside. It was hard, all these layers of grief. But my invitation every Sunday is to find an object on the beach that's reflective or symbolic of that grief. And I remember the one day that I was grieving in the playground, I found this little log that looked like a little stick that looked like a teeter-totter. And I held it and I shared with the group what I was grieving. And the tears kind of came, and it felt so ridiculous to me that I was grieving a playground, but it was just one symbol of all the grief that had been accumulating. And the group held space as I shared, and then we went around and each person shared what they'd chosen, and could have been seaweed or a rock, a heavy rock or a light rock. And we weren't there to fix our grief. We weren't there to problem solve. My invitation is around compassionate listening. So let everybody share without the invitation of nodding your head or saying, yeah, me too. Just simply hold silence. You can hold your hand on your heart for them. But we would go around and each share our experience, and then we would take that object and release it in a way that felt right to us. So I didn't want to tell everybody they had to do it one way. Again, we're not being prescriptive with our rituals. But I gave them some ideas. So you could throw your object, you could swim out to sea and gently release it. You could bring it home with you if you wanted. And we would all have our moment in the ocean, in the cold water, where we were only present. When you're in that kind of cold, expansive ocean, it's very hard to think about all the things that happened earlier that day, or all the things you have to do next. It was a communal experience, and yet it was very individual. Some people didn't swim. They just kind of stood at the water and splashed some water on themselves. Other ones of us kind of swam out and had our own moment of pause and stillness. And then we came back in and we warmed up and we shared a piece of gratitude or something that we had experienced or realized during that experience, and that we were going to carry with us for the rest of the day. And then we closed our circle and we went home. And we've been doing that grief community ritual practice for the last 2 years. And it's been amazing because the practice itself hasn't changed. The structure has been there. And yet every week it's been completely different. Different people, different objects, different emotions, different weather. All of the different factors have made it so that ceremony looks and feels different every week. And yet there is a structure. And that's what I'm going to talk with you today about, is around how to create that structure so that you can have that container, that ceremonial kind of sacred container, which allows things to be what they need to be, depending on who's there, depending on what the weather is like, or what your grief is that day. I'm going to bring back to the share screen. Part of this work for me is really focused on the invisible and the visible. So visible grief and visible mourning happens when, somebody dies and we all know it, and there might be a funeral, there might be something, you're aware that a person is deep in grief, potentially. Invisible grief is what I experienced when we were going through fertility issues and recurrent miscarriages, when oftentimes people would see me and would have no idea that I was grieving. And the challenge with invisible grief or ambiguous loss, there's a lot of terms around it, is that it's just very isolating. You feel very removed from regular day-to-day people because you are experiencing something so deep and so heavy, and there's very little way to recognize that. So for me, the idea of ritual is to make that invisible visible. It's taking those seemingly invisible moments that might happen in our life, whether it's around fertility, whether it's around divorce, whether it's around losing your job, going through menopause, like all of these moments in our life that actually give us a lot of grief, and yet we're not bringing those moments into the visible kind of part of our life. So how can we start to look at ritual and ceremony as an opportunity to make the invisible visible? I'll share this quote from Elizabeth Gilbert. "We do spiritual ceremonies as human beings in order to create a safe resting place for our most complicated feelings of joy or trauma, so that we don't have to haul those feelings around with us forever, weighing us down. We all need such places of ritual safekeeping. And I do believe that if your culture or tradition doesn't have the specific ritual you are craving, then you are absolutely permitted to make up a ceremony of your own devising, fixing your own broken down emotional systems with all the do-it-yourself resourcefulness of a generous plumber poet." I love that. That's when I read this quote, that's how I had been feeling. When I look back at the different ceremonies in my life, and I thought, well, I guess, even when my husband and I decided to get married, the traditional wedding ceremony didn't connect with me. I had a lot of problems with it. It wasn't even that I just didn't want to do it. I had a lot of parts of it that I thought, nope, that's not for me. And once I realized I didn't have to stick to that script, I could go out and I could find my own ritual, and I could create my own ceremony with him, with our family. His father had been given a terminal diagnosis before our wedding. So our wedding had a naturally grief tone to it. There was, we knew it would be the only time that our families would be together, complete. And so how do we honor that? How can we create ritual to bring the space for that and not have it be something that we're just silently brushing aside or skirting over because we want our wedding to be joyful and beautiful and picture perfect? What if instead we flipped it around and created a wedding that had space for grief, that allowed us to kind of hold moments of silence or moments of reflection to acknowledge the bigness that we were all feeling in the room? So what is a ceremony? Again, as I share today, these are my kind of definitions and explorations. I invite you to take this and make it your own in a way that feels right to you. For me, a ceremony is an acknowledgement of what was, what is, and what will be. If you look at a traditional rite of passage, it's framed in that same kind of way of letting go of the past, being still in that kind of liminal space, and then moving forward with intention towards the future. I think of a ceremony as a sacred container that holds together a string of rituals. It can hold together one ritual or 12 rituals. That's up for you to decide. Ultimately, a ceremony tells a story, your story, if it's your ceremony, or if you're a celebrant like myself, I have to be very careful to not go into somebody else's ceremony creation process and impose my stories on them. I want to hold space for their story to come out, or the story of someone who died. So I create a lot of end-of-life ceremonies, and everyone looks unique and different because we're telling their story, we're telling that person's story. So if a ceremony is that kind of sacred container that holds these rituals, what is a ritual? For me, it's simply an intentional action that hopes to create meaning. It's something that we do with intention. So we're not, I often kind of say the idea of routine versus ritual is a routine is something that we fall into. We make our coffee the same way every day. That's our routine. But if you want to elevate that into the realm of ritual, you step into ritual. So you fall into routine, you step into ritual, you become intentional, and you create something that might have meaning for you or for someone else. So if your routine is making coffee the same way every day, but you want to turn that into a ritual, well, you think about, okay, what am I struggling with these days? Let's say my dad died, and I want to find time in my day to reflect and remember him and connect with his memory in some way. So every morning when I set out to make my coffee, I'm going to turn that into a ritual by intentionally pausing to think about my dad. And maybe the smell of the coffee beans reminds me of how he made coffee growing up. Or as the water is boiling, or as I take that first sip, I think about him. I think about his legacy, something that I'm going to carry forward with my day, or a funny story that happened. Whoever it is that you look at, you're now elevating that routine into something of ritual. A ritual can stand alone. You can have one ritual, like making your morning coffee, or you can tie them together to tell that story the way you would in a ceremony. I'm going to take a pause and just check in if there's any questions showing up. I haven't been looking at the chat. Is anybody feeling anything lingering? Anything showing up for you that you'd like to put in the chat to clarify or share back? All right, well, I think we're still good, so I'm going to continue on. Oops, sorry. Share screen. So there are 5 main types of ceremonies. And again, this is me kind of trying to distill all the different ceremonies that I create into these nice little parcels for you and for me. There might be ceremonies that fall outside of these, but the main ceremonies that I'm called to create with people and for myself are often around beginnings, marking the beginning of something new. So think about a birth ceremony of some kind, welcoming a child into the world. Beginning could be a wedding. It could be getting your period for the first time. So creating a ceremony to mark the beginning of something. The next one is merging. So this is marking the transition or coming together of 2 things. So a wedding could also be a merging ceremony. You could look at, I've worked with a lot of people who are starting new businesses, and we create ceremonies to acknowledge that kind of stepping into the new business. And there might be different business partners coming together. Mergings could also look different depending on what stage of life. If you're bringing in a group of women who are all going through an experience together, you might merge their stories in and create a ceremony to acknowledge that. The next one is cycles. So this is ceremonies that help mark the natural rhythm. So you might have a winter solstice ceremony. You might have a big back to school ceremony. You might have these things that happen kind of in these cycles, and you might every year do them the same way or introduce new elements depending on where you're at. There are ceremonies that mark endings. So as we know, every beginning is also an ending. So the beginnings and endings ceremonies typically have a relationship and a connection. But ending ceremonies are often filled with a lot more grief. It could be the end of somebody's life, the end of somebody's marriage, the end of somebody's job. There are often times that we forget to mark the ending. I work with a lot of people who are selling a childhood home, and they want to create what I call a house cooling ceremony. So how do you create a ceremony to mark the end of this house? Well, really, our society tells us just, you sell a house or you move out of a house or apartment, you just focus on the next one. You focus on your house warming, you focus on getting everything in there. And we don't often take the time to mark the ending. I think a lot of times that I've worked with families, when we've created a house cooling ceremony, there's a lot of compounded grief. So one time I was working with a family whose the father in the family had died in the house 3 years earlier, and selling the childhood house brought up all of these big emotions, guilt and shame and grief around the fact that he had helped build this house and they were now leaving it. So it stirred up all the grief from 3 years ago again. So in creating the house cooling ceremony, we weren't just marking the end of the house, we were marking the end of an era. So the rituals that we chose had to be really mindful of that. They had to incorporate all these layers of grief that were present. The final one is a healing ceremony. So this is often marking the process of healing or the journey of grief. So healing ceremonies don't necessarily have to be something that is timely. To give you an example, I worked with a woman who had an abortion 30 years ago, and we created a healing ceremony for her. Even though it happened so long ago, she had been carrying a lot of emotions with her and never had a chance to create that opportunity. So we were able to hold space and create the ceremony that helped her heal, which it often involves elements of forgiveness and anger and all these emotions that we're not often given rituals about. I'm a big believer in finding rituals to express anger and express hurt. One of my favorites is the plate smashing ritual, which is in our app, but it's this idea of, intentionally breaking things and maybe creating something new with them, but just allowing that anger to be released. I remember there was one time in the pandemic and I went to this big raging river and I screamed, and it was this ritual of just releasing this kind of bellow inside of me. And I knew I wouldn't terrify the neighbors because the water was on top of me, but it was just feeling this primal instinct of I just needed to kind of rage. I needed to get this anger out of me and I needed to acknowledge it and hold space for it. So that ritual gave me that opportunity. So those are the 5 types of ceremonies. In that kind of, I'm going to skip over that for a second here. So when you create a ceremony, the way that I go through this is thinking about a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's just a nice, easy mnemonic device. And when I'm overwhelmed, when I'm meeting with a family, who is deep in grief, I often want to kind of make sure I don't forget something. So this just kind of helps me focus. And the first one is around intention. And I think this is really important when you're creating a ceremony for yourself or a ritual, or if you're helping someone create it for themselves. Oftentimes the intention gets buried. It gets confused, and there's a lot of expectations placed on us. So if you think about a celebration of life, oftentimes we think the intention of a celebration of life is to celebrate somebody's life who died and have this element of lightheartedness, this element that kind of, we don't want it to be too mournful. We don't want it to be too kind of depressing. I hear this all the time from families that I work with. But they also want the ceremony to do this and this and this and this and this. And suddenly the intention of the ceremony is so big and so huge, we're never going to do all those things. And they will leave the ceremony feeling like they didn't get what they needed because we didn't get clear on that intention. So oftentimes what's happened is, as I work with people to really define that one intention, what is the one thing you want to feel during the ceremony or after the ceremony? What is that one thing that you hope to create? And if you can't distill that down to one word or one sentence, you're trying to do too much. So what's happened in the past is families have given me their intention. We've really gotten clear on that. And then we've said, you know what? I don't think a celebration of life is what you need. I think that your intention is around healing. And so maybe we create a healing ceremony instead of a celebration of life, because putting somebody who is still kind of in the throes of grief into a place where they feel they need to be joyful and lighthearted and celebratory can actually do a lot more harm. So we have to honor our grief, and we have to listen to it and get really clear on that one intention for our ceremony. Number 2 is really important and really hard, because for me, it's this holding polarities, holding two truths at once. I have a beautiful ritual in the app that we call the two-sided coin. And it's this idea of holding space for two things that we feel are kind of opposing each other or in tension with each other. So it could be grief and gratitude. So if we think about holding space, like I was mentioning with our wedding was a joyful place. There was so much to be grateful for. I wanted to create space for gratitude. And I knew we needed to create space for the grief that we were feeling. So I chose rituals with my husband. We chose rituals intentionally that would bring those two elements that seemed like they were competing with each other, but they weren't. They were simply there. And the beauty of acknowledging these two polarities is that we realize we can feel two things at once. We do not need to always be in pursuit of happiness and pursuit of joy. We can sit and pause, and we can hold grief and shame and fear and anger and joy and love in the very same breath. And I think once I gave myself permission to not have things be in a hierarchy or have to trump each other and be more important, and instead just let them find their natural place and natural rhythm within the ceremonies became a lot more complete and whole. So number 3 stages. This is what I was talking about earlier, finding a way to acknowledge what was, what is, and what will be. So the past, the present, the future, or releasing and finding stillness and, setting intentions for what will come. This is how we framed our app, the Ceremonial. So if I go back a screen here, within the app, you get to pick an opening ritual that is usually connected to the senses. So this is usually something around smell or a taste or touch, or it's connected to the elements in the sense of holding a rock and infusing it as a talisman. So choosing an opening ritual is really important because it kind of sets that tone. It lets everybody know, like we do with our candle, it lets everybody know, okay, I'm stepping into the ceremony space now. I'm intentionally stepping in to this setting, which is ceremonial. Likewise, it's equally important to close it so people know that they're stepping out of it and they can go back to kind of banter and chit chat and not feel like they're ruining the sense of, the integrity of the ceremony. So a ceremony can be 5 minutes long, it can be an hour long, but it should have a clear opening and closing. And then you choose a ritual to acknowledge the past or release. This could be something like writing your words, your emotions on rocks at the beach and throwing them into the water, like I mentioned with the swims. It could be something around fire, or there's this beautiful dissolving paper that I use where we write our thoughts on this paper and let it dissolve and let it go. And then choosing a ritual to be present and still. As I mentioned earlier, the cold water for me has become that vehicle. As somebody who has, been experiencing a lot of anxiety the last number of years, a simple way for me to achieve stillness and create ritual that allows me to just be completely present is to be in that cold water. For others, it's around breath, using breath as meditation. For some, it's around running and exercising and kind of getting into that mindset where on a run, you're not just routinely on a run, you're intentionally trying to get to that moment of stillness where you're not thinking about anything else but the road ahead or but your feet moving. And then choosing a ritual for the future, acknowledging what will be. So this is often, especially around grief and death and dying, around legacy and intention. How are you going to carry somebody's story forward with you? How are you going to carry the wisdom that you've been learning and find ways to weave ritual into your future life? And then we close. So that was the 3, the past, kind of present, future. The 4 is around the 4 elements, and a lot of different cultures have a lot of different ways of talking about the elements. Here in Western culture, we often refer to it as 4 elements, with earth, water, air, fire. There are so many different ways to bring these elements into a ceremonial practice. I could go into them, but I don't have enough time. But I imagine you have a good sense yourself, air being breath, earth being, objects in nature, fire, candles, even sunbathing, going out and in the sun and taking a few minutes for the sun to kind of fill you up and ignite your own fire. And then finally, the 5 senses. So giving way to the smell and taste and touch and sight and hearing. I'm losing my hearing. It's something that I have been grappling with for the last 15 years or so, and it's I hold a lot of grief around it, and I also hold a lot of gratitude for the hearing that I still have. But for me, inviting an audio experience into my ceremony is really important. So I've got all these different tools. I've got this big, beautiful ritual toolbox right here. You can see it's got a heron on it. I love the heron. And in it, there's so many little kind of devices that make noise and sound and music, bells and chimes, things that allow my ears to say, okay, you can hear this. You are now present. You're allowing yourself to drop into this ritual mindset. Smell is also a great one. I've got this beautiful essential oil called beach grass from Tofino, which is a beautiful beach outside of Vancouver. And when I smell it, I am in Tofino. I am transported to my favorite place on the planet. And so if I'm having a day where I'm just rushing through and I just need to kind of pause and tap into that magic of the Tofino beaches, I can take a scent of this and just pause and invite that into my own self-care ritual. Inside our app, we have the ability to create ceremonies for ourselves. I think that that's often the misconception, is that we think we need to have a ceremony as a big wedding or a big funeral or a big something or other where there's lots of people. And that's not true. You can definitely create a solo ceremony. In fact, for me, I do it all the time. And so for a solo ceremony would be different than just a solo ritual. It would be where you were intentionally going into a space where you open up the door and you move through different rituals and then close. So you're creating that ceremonial structure for just yourself. You can do that with a partner. So whether it's you with your husband or with a friend, I have an evening ceremony that I do with my 6-year-old daughter every night. And without fail, if I ever forget, she says, but Mom, our rituals, we have to do our ceremony. We have to do our bedtime ceremony. And so she knows. She could recite it to anyone else that asks. She knows exactly what it includes. And every night it shifts a little bit because it has open-ended questions. But she comes to depend on that. So that ceremonial kind of structure with 2 people can be really beautiful. You can, of course, create a group ceremony, which is usually what we're most familiar with. And then the virtual ceremony, which really we were thrust into the last number of years. Often people said, oh, I don't want to do it. It's plan B. It's a virtual ceremony will never get me what an in-person ceremony would. And it's just not true. It's different. It's apples and oranges. You can't compare. I've had things happen in virtual ceremonies that never would have happened. Beautiful things had we been in person. People have gathered from 13 different countries and different time zones. I hosted a stillbirth ceremony for 75 people. I don't know anyone that's had a ceremony in person with 75 people from folks all around the world to acknowledge something like a stillbirth. So the ability for that virtual setting is pretty phenomenal. So if we think about grief and ritual, I know I've given you a lot of information, but my things that I hope you start to really connect with is that ritual can slow things down for us and for others. Ritual can ground us and center us. Ritual can create meaning in the moment. Ritual can strengthen our connections to the transcendent. So whatever you believe or don't believe, ritual can tap into that. For me, it's this expansiveness and beauty of the planet and nature. I work a lot in the eco-grief world. So dealing with our grief that we hold around climate change. And for me, it's just such a way to connect with the awe that I feel at being present. I live in a particularly stunning place, if anybody's been to North Vancouver, but I'm up in the mountains. I have bears in my backyard, and 5 minutes away is the Pacific Ocean. So I feel particularly blessed to kind of connect with that version of my transcendent, but I felt it everywhere. I felt it in the prairies. I felt it in the cities, when you feel that connection to the buzz of all the people around. So the transcendent is everywhere. Ritual can help shape or form community. The community swims I was telling you about, we don't know each other. You know, some people show up who have never met anyone in the room or anyone at the beach, and they show up and they share their grief and they hold space for the grief of the others. And we go through our ceremony and then we leave and we've had this shared experience. We are an intentional community, and yet we don't know anything about each other beyond our deepest grief and the things that we're holding that day, which really is everything. Ritual can guide us towards what's next. So I think that oftentimes if we don't have these rituals in place, we feel kind of like untethered. We feel like we're adrift because we don't, you know, when somebody dies, we don't know what we're going to do when that first death anniversary comes up or the first Christmas without them. But if we can start to build ritual into our daily life and build that kind of ceremonial muscle, I always say the more we bring ritual into our everyday, the more we'll have those muscles strengthened for when we need them the most. And ritual gives us something to come back to. So it's that feeling that we connect with when we're in that ritual mindset. And if we can start to connect with that on a more regular basis, we'll find a more direct path to getting back to that state. I'm going to have a little bit more. This was the idea of around being purposeful in particular and personal in your rituals. I'm going to just jump over that. We talked a little bit about the elements. So earth rituals tend to ground and calm us. Water rituals can open and connect us. Fire can release and transform us. Air can purify and move us, and ether can expand and connect us. So looking at the different elements can be a beautiful way for yourself to kind of research. And that was the quote that I'm going to put into the chat about the candles. And then I'm going to stop sharing screen and see if there's any questions that have come up. Stop share. Okay. Kelly, I'm percolating what will become memorial, some kind of remembrance ceremony for my mom 2 years after she died. Sorry, I'm just reading here. Thank you, Katie. Yeah, the Be Ceremonial app. The idea, we have rituals or ceremonies across the life cycle to kind of support you. And there is a death anniversary ceremony that you can create for yourself. And again, you kind of pick and choose the rituals that you connect with, the things that might be meaningful, with the invitation to then make them your own. I think that that's my hope, and my biggest takeaway is that when you listen to somebody else's story about a ceremony, sorry, something's beeping. I don't know what it is. Can you hear a beeping? Anybody else? Yeah. I don't think it's on my computer, but maybe it is. You hear it too. Okay. The idea with creating your own ceremony. So listening to other people's stories is meant to inspire you. If you hear somebody else that created a death anniversary ceremony and that sounds amazing, listen to the parts that you connect with and that you're drawn to, and then find a way to make them your own. I think that's the hope for me, is for each person to feel that empowered on their own terms to be able to bring this practice into their life. And the other thing I get asked a lot of questions around is, especially with care providers and end-of-life doulas and people in the grief space, is how do they bring ritual and ceremony to their clients or their patients or their friends and family? And my biggest piece of advice is, until you have a strong relationship with ritual and ceremony yourself, it's really hard to kind of impose it or invite it into somebody else's life. Because the likelihood is they're going to need some guidance. And if you can start to kind of build that own repertoire of rituals that you connect with in your own life, then you can share with them, not as a prescriptive way, but of saying, here's some of the things that I do. Here's a swim that I do every week on the beach. And they might say, oh, that's interesting. I don't have an ocean nearby, but I really love the idea of community grief space. And I wonder if I could take this idea and adapt it. And instead we could meet, in the park every week, and we could each bring something with us, and we could each, let something go and hold space. So that's the beautiful adaptability of ritual and ceremony, is it really can kind of bring us what we need and what we want in that moment. Are there any other questions? No questions coming up. What I'll do then for a minute is going to share the screen one last time and just give you a look as to what Be Ceremonial is, just so everybody can kind of feel. So Be Ceremonial, it's a web-based app, meaning you can access it by a URL. You can go to beceremonial.com and get in, or you can find it in the app stores and you can download it for free. And there's a free kind of sample ceremony for you to create, and then you can kind of pick and choose. You can learn about ceremony. So I put a lot of workshops and stories from people in our community in here, which you can kind of just browse through. And the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 approach that I talked about today, that's in here. How to set an intention, different community stories from people that are using our app. And then there's the ability to create ceremony. So I know that somebody was asking about a death anniversary. So I'll give you an idea of, there's a bunch of ceremonies around fertility and birth. So going through IVF and trying to conceive that whole journey, how can we turn that into a more of a ritual and ceremony setting? So it's not just medicalized. Looking at mother blessings and birth closings. My birth closing ceremony was so powerful. I ended up having births with both my daughters that looked and felt a lot different than I thought. And I realized I had some emotions I needed to acknowledge. So that ceremony really let me feel my way through pregnancy loss, which obviously is a part of my story and a story of a lot of people that I know. This is where we're starting to really build out. So housewarming, relationships ending, menopause, groaning. We're really going to be adding more in here, especially around health and wellness and surgery. I'm working with some people right now around an organ transplant ceremony. So if you've had an organ transplant or moving into one, or an organ removal, like a mastectomy or a hysterectomy, how you can create ceremony to acknowledge your experience. The end of life, which is where a lot of this started, using ritual and ceremony to create a terminal diagnosis ceremony, a living funeral, which I've done lots of, and they're just phenomenal. Here in Canada, medical assistance in dying is legal, and I've worked with lots of families around creating a maid ceremony to kind of, whether I'm present or not, giving them rituals and tools that they can tap into to make that last day something meaningful for the family. Sitting vigil. So if you are with someone in the final hours or days before they die, what are some rituals you can invite into that space? And then grief and legacy, which I imagine is where a lot of us are coming with our grief. So looking at celebrations of life, scattering ashes ceremony, death anniversary, pet loss. So if you were to choose a death anniversary, you would come here and you can either make it for yourself or you can gift it to someone else. So maybe you have a friend whose mom died 5 years ago and this is kind of hard for her. Well, then you could come here and you could create the ceremony for your friend, and you just copy this link and send it to them. And then when they receive it, this is what they would receive. And you can choose the rituals with them, or you can leave it on them on their own. They kind of go through a little welcome. And then they get to build their ceremony. And so if you were to make it for yourself, this is where you would get first. And you go in to build your ceremony and you choose if it's just for you, if it's for you and a partner, for you as a group, or in a virtual setting. So let's assume the death anniversary, maybe it's between you and a sibling and you want to create a ceremony to acknowledge your mom. You would then go through and look at the opening rituals, ways that you want to kind of open space. Maybe there was a song that your mom loved, so you kind of look here and look at what it entails. And if you like it, you would choose your welcome song. And then you look at some different rituals, maybe lineage, maybe looking back at the people, the women that came before you in your matrilineal line. You could choose that one. And then choosing different rituals here. You can kind of explore all of them again. They're just meant to kind of give you a place to start. And then maybe it's something like building a legacy jar, which is one of my favorites. And then closing, and maybe you want to close with some sparklers and invite that in. So you would save your ceremony. You can then go to print it here if you don't want to bring technology into your space, or you can have your phone or your computer with you and move through it. But first, it gives you a list of all the things that you need to prepare. This is the event planner in me. I don't want anybody to get to their ceremony and feel like, oh, does anybody have matches? We don't have matches. It's happened before. So this kind of lays it all out for you. And then when you're ready, you move through your ceremony, and it gives you some language to draw from. Kind of some ideas on what you can do to make that ritual your own. And it just takes you through it step by step. And again, you can go off script. You don't need to follow this word for word. It's meant to be a place. And then you're done. And if you had created this for your friend, it would now exist in your library. So you can see all of the ceremonies you've created for other people. If you have it, you can have a subscription, so a monthly or yearly subscription, and you can create as many ceremonies as you want for yourself, for others, or you can purchase a single ceremony, which in the US I think is about $5. And that's what we're doing. It's still new. It's me and my husband on our own trying to figure this out. And so I welcome thoughts and advice from anybody. If you do create a ceremony and you want to share your story back, I think that's the best way for us to shift the narratives around grief and how we move through this, is by listening to other people's stories and saying, oh, that's amazing. That's what she did to honor. I worked with a woman a few years ago who was turning the age her mother was when her mother died. Her mother was 32 and she was 2 when her mother died. And so as her 32nd birthday approached, she knew she was going to need to kind of have some scaffolding around that day. So I helped her create a ceremony to not only turn the same age that her mom was, but the next day, when she now lived 1 day longer than her mother ever did. And we created this amazing ceremony on supporting her through that transition, that threshold. And her sharing that story has been really helpful to other people. I said, oh, that's interesting. Like in 5 years from now, I'm going to turn the same age my mother was when she died. I hadn't thought about creating a ceremony for that. I think that's a really important thing for us to feel permission and inspiration around. Just looking into the chat here, girls menstruating, saying goodbye to childhood. Definitely. I think that's one of the menarche ceremonies, one I've been working on. I think that I am somebody who, not imposter syndrome necessarily, but I want to make sure I do it properly. And so I really try to work with people that are in this field, who are, who are seeing it a lot on a more regular basis, and to create ceremonies and rituals with them and then bring it into the app for others to experience. So I'm trying to go slow and take my own advice and not try to rush through and just populate. Let's see if there's any other questions. Any suggestions on how to invite people who are unfamiliar with ceremony beyond a religious perspective? I'm having a hard time imagining my family members being willing to join this. Yeah, I mean, it's hard because a lot of people will have these preconceived notions, or they'll feel like it's woo-woo, or they'll feel like you're pushing them to be something that they're not, or they're uncomfortable with holding space for grief. My invitation is always to create a solo ceremony for yourself first, if it's in connection with your own grief, so that you don't move into a group ceremony and feel like you don't get what you need from that. So you can do both. You can create a solo ceremony for yourself in honor of, let's say, an end of life ceremony, and then you can move into a celebration of life, and then your intention changes. Maybe your intention with your solo ceremony is to provide space for healing and forgiveness, but maybe your intention with a celebration of life is to connect with friends and family. So you can see the challenge. If your intention with a celebration of life is around healing and forgiveness, you're likely not going to get that in that ceremonial setting. So what can you do there's no rule in how many ceremonies you can have or how long they need to be. You can create a morning ceremony every day for a week leading up to a celebration of life. There are so many ways that you can, again, flex those muscles and make those rituals part of your day. The Dia de los Ausentes in Latin America, Day to Remember and Honor Lost Babies. Beautiful, Marquis. Thank you. I did not know about that. I know there's a lot of cultural rituals and celebrations and traditions coming up around All Hallows Eve and Dia de los Muertos, and also understanding the role of cultural appropriation here has been important for me to understand what I can step into, what I can acknowledge and witness and applaud from afar, and what I have permission to do on my own. JM, we did a tree planting ceremony on what would have been my son's 29th birthday after his death last year. His brothers planted his remains underneath. That's beautiful. I've worked with a lot of families. The idea of planting things that will grow and become something new. This idea of things allowing us to also have a place to revisit, having those grief markers, those locations that we can come back to. Everyone painted a rock. Oh, I love it. Thank you for sharing that. Toss him Lucky Charms because it was his favorite cereal. Perfect. That's exactly what I love to hear. I created a ceremony recently for someone, and we had Tim Hortons mini donuts here in Canada everywhere, and we create every single choice was a reflection of him, and it was just such a beautiful way for people to feel his presence throughout. Okay, well, I think that is coming to the end. If there's any other, thank you, Sarah. There's my information in there. Again, it was just so lovely to share some of this. I know it's a lot of information, and that my hope is that the app kind of takes all this stuff and just kind of funnels it in and then allows it to become whatever it's going to become out there in the world. And I welcome your input and advice and requests. It is still in its very early stages, so my husband and I are very welcome to ideas and thoughts. Or if you come across a ritual that triggers you in some way, or the language is kind of wrong, I love to know that, because I'm one person trying to put this out there in the world, and I rely so much on the people that are using it to offer back feedback. So thank you so much for being with me today, and I hope that you find ways today and tomorrow and all the other days to bring ritual and ceremony into your life. As a reminder, we're just going to take a breath together and just honor the exchanges that we had and the connections and things that we might have learned or experienced. Just take a couple of deep breaths. And when you're ready, you can blow out your candle. And just take a moment as that smoke dissipates and the wax starts to harden. And just think about your role with ritual and ceremony and with grief, and how you can find a way to honor it, maybe in a smaller, more regular way, rather than having to always feel like we need to do something big and bold. Sometimes just lighting a candle every morning and acknowledging what you're grieving is enough. So with that, I will say good afternoon. It's 1:30 here on the West Coast. And please reach out if you want to connect further. And I wish you all well. And thank you, Sarah, for having me. And I hope you are all enjoying this amazing conference. What a thing it is to get together and honor and acknowledge our grief worldwide. It's just something that didn't exist, back when I was in the thick and throes of my own grief. I think it would have been amazing to have a community like this forming around me. So my love to each and every one of you, and I will hopefully speak to you another time.
Thank you for being here, Megan. That was lovely. Would you like me to share a PDF of your presentation in the handouts and session notes?
Sure, I will send you a new one because I changed it a little bit.
Okay.
But I'll send you a new one, and then everybody can have that, of course. That'd be great.
Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Everyone, we have about 10 minutes until the next session begins. It will be a body scan. I hope to see you all there and joining us, get into our bodies a little bit more. In between then and now, move your bodies, shake it out. We've been sitting in front of the screens all day, so get some free flow and movement going. Maybe throw on some music and dance around for a second. But all right, we will come back together. Thank you again, Megan. We'll chat soon.